The American ambassador to Russia is protesting Moscow's tit-for-tat response to the expulsion of its country's diplomats in the wake of the poisoning of a former Russian spy. The Kremlin has ordered 60 U.S. embassy staff out of the country and announced it will close the American consulate in St. Petersburg. This comes after more than 24 countries, including the U.S., expelled Russian diplomats. It's part of a worldwide effort to condemn the Kremlin for the nerve agent attack on Sergei Skripal and his daughter in England. CBS News foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata has more from Moscow on how the situation is escalating.
Well, the Kremlin this morning said they weren't the ones to initiate a diplomatic war. They were forced to take retaliatory steps in response to what they called hostile, illegal actions by Washington. The Kremlin has so far left little room for compromise. Vladimir Putin has given those 60 U.S. diplomats a week to pack their bags and get out. The retaliation exceeded tit for tat. Shutting down the U.S. consulate in St. Petersburg is a much bigger deal than closing the Russian consulate in Seattle. It's not only far larger, it was the first U.S. mission opened here. The nerve agent attack against a former Russian spy turned the streets of Salisbury, England, into a toxic crime scene that has since triggered the worst diplomatic crisis since the Cold War. President Trump avoided any mention of the poisoning when he congratulated President Putin on his election victory, which made the hardline international reaction more surprising.
There's been enough there to not only convince the United States, but about 25 other countries that have taken similar actions, that there's enough evidence to believe that the Russian state was behind this action in Salisbury.
Actually, 28 countries in all that have expelled more than 150 Russian diplomats since the attack. The Russians vehemently deny any involvement and insist the backlash is nothing more than a Washington-orchestrated bullying campaign over its allies.
You don't believe that there's a level of distrust against Russia?
I think that this is what is the main goal of the United States and Great Britain, to make Russia be regarded on the world stage, international stage, like, a hooligan.
There's some good news to report about Yulia Skripal, the daughter of the poisoned spy. Doctors say her condition is rapidly improving, but that raises another issue. The Russians are demanding that the British government allow them to see her, saying, after all, she is a Russian citizen. Anne-Marie?
Charlie D'Agata, thank you. With more now, we are joined by Face the Nation moderator and senior foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan in Washington. So, Margaret, I want to get to the president's comments that he made in his speech. But first, I want to ask you about this escalation in regards to the tension between Russia and the U.S. So we've got 60 Americans being kicked out of Russia in response to the 60 Russian diplomats that were kicked out of the U.S. So we have one round of tit for tat. Can we see this going around again and getting even sort of worse?
Yes, U.S. and U.K. officials that I've spoken with say that this is not the end of the retaliation. Because of this chemical attack that you saw on the streets of the U.K., they say this kind of coordinated response. It's not just the U.S., but it's now 28 different countries who've expelled Russian nationals. And the reason they are acting in solidarity is because this is so serious. And they think it's really taken Russia by surprise, because you haven't seen all these Western countries move in unison in the past when it came to election meddling, when it came to Russia's intervention in Ukraine. It was pretty hard to get all those European countries to put in place those financial sanctions. This time you're seeing pretty swift action because of the seriousness of seeing this kind of chemical weapon being used. And they believe, these officials I talked to say, that this is part of a program that Vladimir Putin authorized himself to have these kind of assassinations take place overseas.
So, Margaret, not too long ago in a speech that Vladimir Putin made, he showed this video that seemed to show a missile heading towards the United States. And now we're hearing that the president had a conversation with Putin and basically said, look, if you want an arms race, you can have an arms race, but I'll probably win. What is the status of the relationship between Russia and the United States? It's really hard to tell at this point.
Yeah, there's a lot of chest thumping. But if you look at the testing there of those intercontinental ballistic missiles that Russia says it's developing, this is a pretty serious accusation. It goes back to the Obama administration 2014. Then the Trump administration last year said Russia is cheating on an arms control agreement known as the INF Treaty that was supposed to sort of be a mutual freeze. The Trump administration this past year said, look, if you're going to do this, we're going to start research into our ICBMs. So you have a literal escalation on the arms race. At the same time, you have this tremendous spike in tensions diplomatically. And remember, this doesn't come out of nowhere. If you look at U.S. tensions with Russia, this goes back to the military intervention in Syria, in Ukraine. That was an annexation of a European country. Remember that shooting down of that civilian airliner. Then you have the election interference, not just in the United States, but in other European countries. And you have now this decision by Western allies to say we all have to stand together on this case of the chemical weapons attack because Russia thinks they can separate our alliance. So that is why diplomatically it's being seen as significant to have the United States take such a significant action with expelling this high number of Russian nationals and to have its allies follow suit.
Okay, I want to talk about something the president said yesterday during a speech. He talked about pulling U.S. troops out of Syria, letting the guys, everyone else sort of handle things because ISIS is pretty much under control. Apparently that caught, some people in the Pentagon off guard. Yeah. What is the likelihood of that actually happening?
Well, this is another case of what the president saying being very different from what his national security team is advising and has authorized. It's not new for the president to say, hey, we'll do what we got to do and then we'll come home, take the oil, right? He said that about Iraq. He said that about Syria. However, it surprised many to hear the president say this explicitly, not only because of the timing, but because how many times has the president said, I don't want to signal to our enemies what our intent is. And he was harshly critical of the Obama administration for announcing that it was going to withdraw troops from the battlefield in Afghanistan because he said that signal to the enemy, just wait us out. He seems to be saying the same thing when it comes to the far smaller U.S. military presence in Syria, which is just about 2,000 troops. It also raised eyebrows because when you look at Syria, it is accurate to say that the U.S. is only authorized to fight ISIS there, but the troops on the ground, the fighters on the ground, are a mix not only of terrorists the U.S. is already authorized to fight, but Iran. And the president has constantly said, I'm going to be tough with Iran. So it was very surprising to hear him say they can own the battlefield along with Russia.
Right. Margaret Brennan, thank you so much. Well, this Sunday on Face the Nation, Margaret talks with Republican Senator Tim Scott, Republican Congressman Trey Gowdy, former Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. You can watch it right here on CBSN at 11 a.m. or 6 p.m. Sunday.